There was an awful lot of reaction coming in now on the story about U.S. and Cuba. Robert Menendez is a Democrat out of New Jersey. He's saying that trading Alan Gross, the American, for, quote, convicted criminals sets an extremely dangerous precedent. He says that the president's actions on Cuba vindicates the brutal behavior of the Cuban government. So what about the United States charting new ground with Cuba? The president will talk later today at noon Eastern Time. Senator Marco Rubio, Republican from Florida, is with me now. His parents left Cuba in the 1950s, immigrating to the U.S. as Fidel Castro began his rise to power. Senator, good morning to you, and thank you for your time. Your reaction to what we expect today at noon Eastern.
Well, a couple points. First of all, obviously we're all glad that Mr. Gross is going to be back with his family. He never did anything wrong. He was not a spy. He was not a criminal. He was a hostage. And it's unfortunate that the Cuban government held him for 5 years and basically almost killed him in captivity. I'm not in favor of the process by which his release was acquired, because I think it does set a very dangerous precedent. It puts a price on every American abroad. Governments now know that if they can take an American hostage, they can get very significant concessions from the United States. But later today, the president, I believe, will announce measures that go well beyond simply the release of Mr. Gross. I think they will entail things like normalized diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba, the opening up of more commerce and trade with a dictatorship. My interest in Cuba has always been the furthering of democracy and freedom. I think the people of Cuba have a right, if they are free, to choose any economic system they want. Nothing the president will announce today is going to further that goal. And it's ironic that a week after we imposed sanctions on human rights violators in Venezuela, we are lifting sanctions on a government that has taught the Venezuelans how to commit these human rights violations. It's absurd. And it's part of a long record of coddling dictators and tyrants that this administration has established.
Well, as you know, the Cuban embargo has been in place for 50 years, since the early 1960s, and that is law in America. So legally, what could the president do now?
Well, the president can increase the amount of remittances. He can increase the participation of U.S. telecommunications companies within Cuba. The problem that I have is not those measures. The problem is that in return, the Cubans have agreed to do things like release political prisoners and allow more internet access on the island. But they're creating no economic openings. There is no concessions on freedom of speech, no concessions on elections, no concessions on the freedom to have alternative political parties, no concessions on ever having elections or anything of that matter. What democratic concessions? And this notion that somehow being able to travel more to Cuba and send more money to Cuba and travel and sell more consumer products in Cuba, the idea that that is going to lead to some democratic opening is absurd. But it is par for the course with an administration that is constantly giving away unilateral concessions, whether it's Iran or in this case Cuba, in exchange for nothing. And that's what's happening here.
Do you think the U.S. Congress would agree to lift the embargo? Is there movement for that?
No, I know it would not. No, there is not support for that. And I think that the embargo is misunderstood. The embargo is not there to punish Cuba or even the Cuban government. The embargo serves as leverage. The law is very clear. It is written and codified. The embargo could be lifted tomorrow if Cuba opens up democratically. That's all they have to do for the embargo to be lifted, is they have to become a democracy, like virtually every other country in the hemisphere. And for us to now basically, for this administration, to basically undermine that leverage in exchange for symbolic measures, you know, the releasing of 53 political prisoners, that's fantastic, but they never should have been in prison to begin. And they could be re-imprisoned next week if they re-engage in civil society and in protesting.
What do you know about these 3 Cuban spies held here that apparently are headed home?
Well, they're Cuban spies, but they're not just benign Cuban spies. There were 5 of them originally. 2 have been released and returned to Cuba. The other 3 are here still, although I imagine they've now been released. These Cuban spies were involved in providing information to the Cuban government that led to the murder of U.S. citizens and an infamous shoot-down of the Brothers to the Rescue aircraft back in 1996. These were airplanes that used to patrol the Straits of Cuba to find people on rafts to save their lives. The Cuban government shot them down over international waters, and they did so largely based on information that at least one of these spies provided them. These spies will now receive a hero's welcome in Cuba.
Does this all suggest to you, with 2 years left in the presidency, that President Obama wants to visit Cuba and pay a visit to Havana and do it while president and make a mark?
Well, I don't know what his intentions are. I can tell you that his foreign policy is at a minimum naive, and perhaps even truly counterproductive to the future of democracy in the region. I mean, again, I go back to the point that I made a few minutes ago. Just last week, we imposed sanctions on human rights violators in Venezuela. But the people who are supporting the Venezuelans and conducting those human rights sanctions, literally, the Cubans have taken over the Venezuelan government. We're actually lifting sanctions on them. How absurd is that? And it's just par for the course. Now, all of these tyrants around the world know that the U.S. can be had, that it's a pretty easy deal. At a minimum, I would say this: Barack Obama is the worst negotiator that we've had as president since at least Jimmy Carter, and maybe in the modern history of this country.
Well, Senator Rubio, thank you for your time. Marco Rubio from Washington, D.C. Appreciate you coming on with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Martha.